The moment my sister smiled during the will reading was the moment I realized something was terribly wrong. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 34 years old, and 3 weeks after we buried my father, I sat in a quiet lawyer's office in Columbus, Ohio, listening to my sister calmly explain to the room why everything my dad owned now belonged to her. At the time, everyone believed her. Even me. Looking back now, the signs were obvious, but grief has a strange way of making you slow to question things that don't feel right. The lawyer's office was on the second floor of an old brick building downtown, the kind with narrow hallways and framed certificates on the walls. Outside the window I could see gray clouds hanging low over the city, the kind of cold Midwestern afternoon where the air feels heavy and the streets look almost empty. Around the table sat my Aunt Linda, my cousin Mark, my father's old neighbor Harold, and my sister Melissa, sitting straight in her chair like she had been waiting for this meeting her entire life. The lawyer, Jonathan Reeves, adjusted his glasses and opened a thick folder in front of him. My father's name was printed neatly across the top of the first page. Robert Carter. Seeing it written there hit harder than the funeral had. My dad had passed away at 68 after a long illness that had stretched across the last 2 years of his life. During those 2 years I had spent almost every day at the house helping him. Groceries, doctor visits, fixing things around the place, making sure he took his medication on time. It never felt like a sacrifice. He was my father. That's just what you do. Melissa, on the other hand, had lived almost 400 miles away in Atlanta for most of that time. She called occasionally. Sometimes she sent flowers on holidays. But being physically present was never really her thing. At least, that's what I thought. Until the last few months of Dad's life, when suddenly she started showing up more often. Back then I assumed she just wanted to spend time with him before it was too late. Now I understand it a little differently. The lawyer began reading the document slowly, his voice calm and professional. He listed small things first. Personal belongings. A few. Charitable donations Dad had arranged. Some tools from the garage going to our cousin Mark. Nothing unusual. Melissa sat quietly with her hands folded in front of her, occasionally nodding like she already knew exactly what the lawyer was about to say next. I remember noticing that detail but brushing it aside. Grief makes you ignore your instincts sometimes. Then Mr. Reeves turned a page and cleared his throat. This next portion concerns the primary estate. My sister shifted slightly in her chair and glanced around the room. For a split second, I thought I saw a hint of anticipation in her eyes. The house on Maplewood Drive, Mr. Reeves continued, along with the primary savings account and retirement funds, are designated to Melissa Carter. The words hung in the air like the room had suddenly lost oxygen. My Aunt Linda let out a quiet gasp. Cousin Mark leaned back in his chair and looked over at me with a confused expression. I just sat there, staring at the wooden surface of the table. The Maplewood house wasn't just property. It was the house we grew up in. The place where my dad still lived. The place I had been helping maintain for the past 2 years while he was sick. And according to what we had just heard, it now belonged entirely to Melissa. My sister slowly exhaled, almost like she had been holding her breath waiting for confirmation. Then she looked toward me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Dad updated things before he passed, she said calmly. He wanted it that way. I felt several pairs of eyes turn toward me around the table. No one said anything directly, but the silence carried an unspoken assumption that maybe Melissa had been the one Dad trusted more in the end. That maybe I had misunderstood my place in his life. I didn't argue. I didn't question it. At that moment I was still trying to process the idea that the house, the savings, everything Dad had built over 40 years, had apparently been signed over to my sister. Mr. Reeves continued reading smaller clauses from the will while Melissa sat there with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. I remember thinking that maybe this was simply how things were meant to turn out. Maybe Dad had reasons. I didn't understand. Maybe I had missed something during those last months while he was sick. But what none of us realized sitting in that quiet office that afternoon was that the lawyer hadn't reached the end of the documents yet. And the final page he was about to open would change everything we thought we knew. To understand how my sister managed to sit in that lawyer office looking so confident, you have to go back almost 2 years before my father passed away, back to a time when life in the Maplewood house still followed a slow and predictable routine. My father, Robert Carter, had lived in that house for more than 35 years. It was a modest 2-story place with white siding, a creaky front porch, and a maple tree in the yard that had probably been there longer than any of us. Growing up, Melissa and I used to climb that tree during the summer, competing to see who could reach the highest branch. But by the time we were adults, life had pulled us in very different directions. I stayed in Columbus. I worked as a project manager for a small construction company and rented an apartment about 15 minutes away from Dad's place. Melissa moved to Atlanta when she was 26. She always said Columbus felt too small for her ambitions. She wanted something bigger, faster, more exciting. For years our relationship settled into something polite but distant. We spoke on holidays, birthdays, and occasionally during family events. It was never hostile. It was just not close. Then, about 2 years before Dad passed away, everything started to change. It began with small things. Dad would forget where he left his car keys. Then he started missing appointments. One afternoon he called me asking if I could drive him to his doctor because he did not feel comfortable getting behind the wheel. That appointment turned into a series of tests. Those tests turned into specialist visits. Eventually the doctors told us that his health was declining in ways that would require regular care and monitoring. From that point forward, I began stopping by the house almost every day. Sometimes I would bring groceries. Sometimes I would cook dinner. Other days I would help him organize paperwork or drive him to medical appointments across the city. It never felt like a burden. In fact, those evenings sitting at the kitchen table talking with him became some of the most meaningful moments we had shared since I was a kid. My father was never the type to talk about feelings very easily, but during those quiet hours he started sharing stories about his younger years, about the construction business he had built from scratch, and about the choices he made raising Melissa and me after our mother passed away. Looking back now, I realize those conversations meant more to him than he probably ever said out loud. During most of that first year, Melissa rarely visited. She called occasionally and asked how Dad was doing. She sent a few gift baskets around Christmas. But physically being there was something that almost always fell to me. Dad never complained about that. In fact, whenever I mentioned that Melissa might try to visit more often, he would just shrug and say she had her own life to worry about. Then something changed about 6 months before he passed away. Suddenly Melissa started showing up more frequently. At first it seemed like a good thing. She flew in from Atlanta twice within 1 month, which was unusual for her. The first time she arrived, she hugged Dad tightly at the front door and told him she was sorry she had not visited sooner. I remember standing in the kitchen watching them talk and thinking maybe this was exactly what our family needed. Maybe she had realized that time with him was running out. But during that visit I began noticing small details that felt a little strange. Instead of spending most of her time simply talking with Dad, Melissa asked a lot of questions about practical things. She wanted to know where he kept certain documents. She asked about the mortgage even though the house had been paid off for years. She asked whether Dad still used the same bank account he had always used. At the time, I assumed she was just trying to help organize things. When someone in the family becomes sick, those conversations sometimes happen. But the pattern continued during her next visit. One evening while Dad was resting upstairs, Melissa and I sat at the kitchen table going through a stack of envelopes that had arrived in the mail. She picked up a bank statement and studied it longer than necessary, before placing it back down. Then she looked at me and said something that felt harmless at the time but sounds very different now when I remember it. She said, "Daniel, someone needs to make sure everything is handled properly when the time comes." I nodded because that seemed reasonable. What I did not realize then was that Melissa was already thinking several steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Over the next several months Melissa's visits became more frequent, and each time she arrived the atmosphere inside the Maplewood house shifted in small but noticeable ways. At first everything seemed normal. She would bring coffee from a cafe down the street or pick up dinner from a restaurant Dad liked, and for a while the evenings felt almost like the old days when our family still felt whole. Dad seemed happy to see her more often. He would sit at the kitchen table smiling while she told stories about Atlanta and the people she worked with. But as the weeks passed I began to notice that Melissa rarely stayed focused on simple conversations for very long. Her attention always drifted toward practical matters. One afternoon she asked Dad if he still kept his important paperwork in the same filing cabinet in the study. Another day she asked whether the house insurance policy had been updated recently. On another visit she casually asked if he had ever considered simplifying his finances to make things easier later. None of those questions sounded suspicious on their own, but the pattern slowly started to feel unusual. Meanwhile my routine with Dad continued the way it always had. I would arrive after work around 5:30 in the evening, park in the driveway under the maple tree, and walk through the familiar creak of the front porch boards before stepping inside. Most nights I cooked something simple while Dad sat at the kitchen counter telling stories or asking about my job. Some evenings we watched baseball together in the living room. Those quiet moments were not dramatic, but they felt important in a way that is hard to explain unless you have watched a parent grow older right in front of you. Melissa usually stayed in town for 2 or 3 days at a time before flying back to Atlanta. But during one particular visit about 4 months before Dad passed away something about her behavior felt different. She arrived earlier in the afternoon while I was still at work. When I got to the house that evening the first thing I noticed was that the study door was closed. That room had always been Dad's workspace where he kept documents, old contracts from his construction business, and stacks of folders organized inside a tall wooden filing cabinet. I knocked lightly before opening the door. Melissa was sitting at the desk with several folders spread out in front of her. She looked up quickly and smiled as if nothing unusual was happening. I asked what she was doing and she said she was helping Dad organize paperwork so that everything would be easier for the future. Dad was sitting nearby in his chair, looking slightly tired but calm. At the time I accepted the explanation without thinking much about it. After dinner that night Melissa brought up the topic again. She said that as Dad's health changed it might make sense for someone to help manage certain things like bank accounts and property documents. Her tone sounded practical rather than emotional, like someone discussing a routine responsibility. I remember Dad listening quietly while she spoke. After a moment he simply said that everything important was already handled and that the lawyer had copies of the necessary documents. Melissa nodded, but I noticed the brief pause before she responded. She asked which lawyer he meant. Dad replied that it was the same attorney who had helped him with legal paperwork years ago when he retired from the construction business. Jonathan Reeves. At the time that name meant very little to me. But Melissa seemed to register it carefully. Over the following weeks she mentioned legal matters several more times. She asked Dad whether his will had been updated recently and whether the house deed was still organized the same way it had always been. Dad usually responded with short answers and then changed the subject. Looking back now I realize that those conversations never seemed to trouble him. If anything, he appeared slightly amused by how persistent Melissa could be. One evening after she had stepped outside to take a phone call, Dad leaned toward me across the kitchen table and gave a small shake of his head like he had just witnessed something mildly ridiculous. Then he smiled and said something that did not fully make sense to me at the time. He said that sometimes people spend so much energy planning for the future that they forget how unpredictable it can be. I laughed and asked what he meant by that. Dad only shrugged and said that eventually everyone learns the truth in their own time. I did not realize then that he already understood far more about the situation than either Melissa or I did. About 2 months before my father passed away the atmosphere inside the Maplewood house changed in a way that felt subtle at first but became impossible to ignore once I looked back on it. Melissa began staying longer during her visits, sometimes for nearly a full week instead of just a couple of days. She started presenting it as if she was simply trying to help more. She scheduled grocery deliveries, organized medication reminders on her phone, and even rearranged several drawers in the kitchen so that everything felt more efficient. On the surface it looked like she was stepping up as a daughter who wanted to support her father. But there was something else happening underneath that I did not fully recognize at the time. Slowly, almost without anyone announcing it, Melissa began placing herself between Dad and many of the decisions that used to happen naturally. If a doctor called with a question, she would answer first. If a piece of mail arrived, she would often open it before anyone else noticed it sitting on the counter. When I asked about certain documents, she would casually say that she had already taken care of it. One evening after work I arrived at the house and found Melissa standing in the living room with Dad's laptop open on the coffee table. She told me she was helping him organize his online banking so that things would be easier to track. Dad sat quietly in his armchair nearby, watching television with the volume turned low. I remember asking if everything was all right, and Melissa immediately smiled and said she was just making sure Dad did not have to worry about small details anymore. At the time that explanation sounded reasonable, but something about the way she said it made me feel like I had somehow been pushed slightly out of the circle of trust that had existed between Dad and me for the past 2 years. Around that same period Melissa also started asking more direct questions about the house itself. One afternoon while we were standing on the back porch, she looked out across the yard and asked whether I had ever considered selling the property after Dad was gone. The question caught me off guard because it felt premature. I told her that I had never really thought about it and that Dad still lived there, so discussing the future of the house felt strange. Melissa shrugged and said she was only thinking practically. She said houses in that neighborhood were now selling for well over $300,000 and that it would be important for the family to make smart decisions when the time came. I remember feeling uncomfortable with the direction of that conversation, so I changed the subject. But from that moment forward I began noticing how often Melissa talked about the future in terms of ownership and control. She mentioned the house, the savings account, even the small investment portfolio Dad had built over the years. Meanwhile Dad himself remained calm and strangely observant during all of this. He rarely interrupted Melissa when she spoke about these things. Instead he listened quietly and sometimes gave a small nod that was difficult to interpret. One evening after Melissa had stepped outside again to take another phone call, Dad looked at me from across the kitchen table with an expression that seemed thoughtful rather than worried. He asked how work had been going and whether the construction company I worked for was still planning to expand into new neighborhoods outside Columbus. I told him about a project we were managing and he listened carefully before giving a slow smile. Then he said something that stayed with me long after that night ended. He said that when people believe they already know the outcome of a story, they sometimes stop paying attention to the details that actually decide how it ends. I asked him what he meant by that, but he only shook his head and told me that time has a way of revealing everything when the moment is right. At the time I assumed he was simply speaking in one of his thoughtful moods. What I did not realize was that Dad had already begun quietly preparing for something none of us in that house fully understood yet. About 3 weeks before my father passed away, something happened that felt small at the time but later became one of the most important moments I could remember. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in early October. The air outside had started to turn colder and the maple tree in the front yard had begun dropping red and orange leaves across the driveway. I had just finished cooking dinner when Dad called my name from the hallway outside the kitchen. His voice sounded calm but serious in a way that immediately caught my attention. When I walked into the living room, he was standing near the window holding his jacket. That alone was unusual because by that point he rarely went anywhere in the evenings. He told me he needed a ride downtown for a short appointment. I asked if it was a doctor visit, but he shook his head and said it was something legal he wanted to take care of before winter arrived. I did not think much about it at the time. I grabbed my car keys and helped him into the passenger seat of my truck before we drove across town through the evening traffic. The building we stopped in front of was an older brick office building near the courthouse district. When we stepped inside the lobby, the name on the directory confirmed where we were. Reeves and Bennett Legal Services. I remember glancing at the sign and realizing that this must be the lawyer Dad had mentioned before. Jonathan Reeves. Dad placed a hand on my shoulder and told me he only needed about 30 minutes. He said the appointment would be quick and that I could wait in the lobby if I wanted. I sat there in one of the leather chairs flipping through a magazine while he disappeared down the hallway with the receptionist guiding him toward a conference room. Looking back now, I remember noticing how steady his steps seemed that evening. Despite his health problems, he walked with a quiet determination, like he had something important on his mind. After about 40 minutes he returned with a calm expression and thanked the receptionist before we headed back outside to the truck. During the drive home he was unusually quiet. I asked him if everything had gone well and he nodded. Then he looked out the passenger window for a moment before saying something that seemed oddly specific. He said that sometimes the best way to protect a family is to make sure the truth eventually has the right stage to appear on. I laughed and asked if that was another one of his philosophical moods. Dad smiled slightly but did not explain any further. When we pulled into the driveway he placed his hand on the dashboard before opening the door and said one more thing that I still hear clearly in my mind. He told me that no matter what happened in the future I should trust the process and listen carefully when the lawyer speaks. At the time I assumed he was simply referring to ordinary legal matters that might come up after he passed away. I did not realize that those words were meant as a quiet warning. Over the following weeks Dad's health began to decline more rapidly. The doctor visits increased and he spent more time resting in his chair near the living room window. Melissa started visiting even more frequently during that period. She often arrived with folders or printed documents and asked Dad to review certain details with her. Sometimes she would sit beside him with a notebook while discussing accounts and paperwork in a tone that sounded almost like a business meeting. I noticed that whenever she brought up those topics Dad would answer briefly but rarely seemed interested in continuing the discussion for very long. Instead he often changed the subject back to simple things like the weather, baseball scores, or memories from years ago. One evening after Melissa left the room to take another phone call I asked Dad if he felt comfortable with how often she had been organizing his paperwork lately. He looked at me with that same calm expression I had seen in the lawyer's office parking lot weeks earlier. Then he smiled gently and said something that at the time sounded mysterious but reassuring. He said that when people are convinced they already hold the winning hand they rarely look closely at the cards that have not been played yet. I nodded even though I did not fully understand what he meant. What I did not know was that only a few weeks later we would all be sitting in Jonathan Reeves's office listening to the will being read, and those final cards my father had quietly placed on the table were about to change everything. The weeks after that evening felt strangely quiet, almost like the house itself understood that time was slowly running out. Dad spent most of his days resting in the living room chair beside the front window, the same spot where sunlight always reached the carpet in the afternoon. I continued stopping by every day after work, bringing groceries or cooking dinner the way I had done for nearly 2 years. But Melissa's presence in the house became more constant than it had ever been before. Instead of flying back to Atlanta after a few days, she started staying for longer stretches, sometimes nearly 2 full weeks at a time. She spoke often about how important it was for the family to stay organized during difficult moments, and she moved through the house with a quiet sense of purpose that made it seem like she was already managing everything. She sorted through paperwork on the dining room table, labeled folders, and occasionally took phone calls in the hallway where her voice dropped low enough that I could not hear what she was discussing. At first I assumed she was coordinating medical appointments or speaking with insurance companies. But one evening I walked into the kitchen and noticed several envelopes spread across the counter. They were bank statements and documents from Dad's retirement accounts. Melissa quickly gathered them into a folder when she saw me enter the room. She smiled and said she was just making sure nothing important slipped through the cracks. I nodded because it sounded reasonable, but something about the way she had quickly moved those papers made the moment linger in my mind. Meanwhile Dad continued watching everything quietly from his chair. He rarely interrupted Melissa when she spoke about finances or property. Instead he observed the conversations with a calm patience that I did not fully understand. One afternoon I asked him privately if he wanted me to handle more of the paperwork so that Melissa did not feel overwhelmed. Dad simply shook his head and told me not to worry about it. He said that sometimes people reveal more about themselves when they believe no one is paying attention. His tone was not angry or disappointed. If anything, it sounded almost thoughtful, like he was watching a story unfold that he had already anticipated. A few days later, Melissa suggested that we begin preparing the house for what she called the next chapter. She talked about organizing documents that might be needed after Dad passed away and asked whether we knew where the deed to the property was stored. She also asked several questions about the savings accounts and the small investment portfolio Dad had built during his years running the construction business. Her voice sounded confident, almost like she was already rehearsing responsibilities she believed would soon belong to her. I remember feeling uneasy during those conversations, but I could not explain exactly why. Nothing she said sounded openly wrong. She always framed everything as planning ahead or making sure the family would avoid confusion later. Dad listened quietly while she spoke. Occasionally he nodded but rarely added much to the discussion. One evening after Melissa stepped outside to answer another phone call, I sat across from Dad at the kitchen table while he slowly stirred a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The house was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock above the refrigerator. I finally asked him if he felt comfortable with all the planning Melissa had been doing. Dad looked at me carefully for a moment before setting the spoon down beside his cup. Then he gave a small smile that looked almost amused. He said that patience is sometimes the most powerful tool a person can have because it allows the truth to arrive exactly when it needs to. I told him I was not sure I understood what he meant. Dad leaned back in his chair and looked toward the hallway where Melissa had stepped outside minutes earlier. Then he said something that I did not fully appreciate until much later. He said that when the right moment comes, the truth does not need anyone to defend it because it has a way of speaking clearly all on its own. At the time I assumed he was simply offering one of his thoughtful observations about life. I did not realize that only a few weeks later we would all be sitting together in a lawyer's office while the final documents were opened and the truth my father had quietly prepared would finally have its moment to speak. The day of the will reading arrived 3 weeks after we buried my father, and the entire drive to Jonathan Reeves's office felt heavier than I expected. The sky over Columbus was gray that afternoon, the kind of quiet overcast day where the street seemed slower than usual. I parked outside the same brick building where I had once waited in the lobby while Dad handled his appointment weeks earlier. At the time I had no idea how important that visit would eventually become. Melissa arrived a few minutes later wearing a dark coat and carrying a leather folder under her arm. She greeted me politely but with a confidence in her voice that I had not heard before. It was not arrogance exactly, but there was a certainty in the way she walked toward the building, like someone who already believed she understood how the meeting would end. Inside the conference room, several family members had already gathered around the large wooden table. Our Aunt Linda sat near the window, and our cousin Mark leaned back quietly in his chair. Mr. Jonathan Reeves entered with a thick folder of documents and gave everyone a respectful nod before taking his seat. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the building's heating system. When the lawyer began reading the will, his voice was steady and professional. He started with smaller items first, just as he had earlier in the meeting when I first heard the words that made my stomach sink. Personal belongings, charitable donations, a few tools and keepsakes passed along to extended relatives. Everyone listened carefully while the pages turned one by one. Then Mr. Reeves reached the section that addressed the primary estate. The house on Maplewood Drive and the main savings accounts were listed under Melissa's name. When those words were spoken out loud, I felt the same quiet shock settle across the table that I had experienced earlier. My aunt looked toward me with sympathy while Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Melissa simply nodded with a composed expression as if the outcome confirmed something she had already known for weeks. She folded her hands on the table and glanced briefly in my direction before looking back toward the lawyer. I remember thinking in that moment that maybe all the planning and organizing she had done in the past few months had been leading to exactly this result. Maybe she had convinced Dad to change things near the end of his life. The lawyer continued reading the remaining lines from that page and then paused. He closed the folder halfway and adjusted his glasses before speaking again. His tone remained calm, but there was a slight shift in the room as everyone leaned forward waiting for what would come next. Melissa looked completely relaxed, almost satisfied, like a person who believed the most important part of the meeting had already passed. That was when Mr. Reeves cleared his throat and said something that caused the entire room to grow even quieter. He explained that there was an additional document attached to the estate file that had been prepared shortly before Robert Carter passed away. He reached into the folder and carefully removed a sealed envelope that none of us had seen before. The paper looked newer than the other documents on the table and the seal across the flap remained intact. Melissa's confident expression flickered for the first time since the meeting began. She leaned slightly forward and asked what the document was. Mr. Reeves answered calmly that it was an amendment to the will that had been signed and witnessed during a private meeting with Robert Carter only weeks before his passing. I felt a sudden memory flash in my mind of that quiet evening when I had driven Dad downtown to this very office while waiting in the lobby reading an old magazine. Suddenly his words from the truck that night echoed in my head again. Trust the process and listen carefully when the lawyer speaks. Mr. Reeves placed the envelope on the table and slowly opened the seal while everyone in the room watched in complete silence. The faint sound of paper unfolding seemed unusually loud in the quiet conference room. Melissa sat perfectly still with her eyes fixed on the document while the lawyer scanned the page inside. For several seconds no one said anything. Then Mr. Reeves looked up from the document and adjusted his glasses again before speaking the next words that would change the entire outcome of that meeting. Mr. Reeves lowered the document slightly and looked around the conference table as if making sure every person in the room understood the importance of what he was about to say. The quiet inside that office felt heavier than before. I could hear the faint ticking of a wall clock behind us and the soft rustle of paper as the lawyer adjusted the page in his hands. Melissa leaned forward in her chair, her earlier confidence now replaced with a cautious expression that suggested she had not expected another document to appear. Mr. Reeves began speaking slowly and clearly. He explained that the paper inside the envelope was a legally executed amendment to Robert Carter's will, signed 2 weeks before his passing and witnessed by 2 independent legal staff members inside this very office. He paused briefly before continuing, almost as if giving everyone a moment to absorb the words. Then he read the contents of the amendment aloud. According to the updated document, the original distribution listed earlier that day had been revised. The Maplewood Drive property, along with the majority of the savings and retirement accounts associated with the estate, were now designated to Daniel Carter. For several seconds no one in the room reacted. The words seemed to hang in the air as if our minds needed extra time to process them. My Aunt Linda blinked in confusion while Mark leaned forward in his chair with a surprised look on his face. I sat there completely still, trying to understand what I had just heard. Melissa, however, reacted first. She straightened in her seat and immediately asked the lawyer if there had been some mistake. Her voice remained controlled, but the certainty that had filled her tone earlier was no longer there. Mr. Reeves calmly shook his head and slid the amendment across the table so that everyone could see the signatures and legal stamps at the bottom of the page. He explained that Robert Carter had requested the meeting personally and had completed the amendment with full legal witnesses present. The document was filed in the estate records on the same day it was signed. Melissa stared down at the paper as if searching for something that would prove it was invalid. The room remained silent while she read through the page again. Then she asked why she had not been informed about the change. Mr. Reeves responded with the same professional calm he had maintained throughout the entire meeting. He explained that estate amendments are private decisions made by the individual creating the will and that Robert Carter had specifically requested that the updated document remain sealed until the official reading of the estate. I felt another memory rise in my mind at that moment. The evening drive downtown. The quiet lobby. My father's calm expression when he returned to the truck. And his words that I had not fully understood at the time. Trust the process and listen carefully when the lawyer speaks. Mr. Reeves continued explaining that the amendment also included a short statement written by my father himself. He looked down at the page again before reading the final paragraph aloud. In that statement my father explained that he had carefully observed the actions of both of his children during the final years of his life. He wrote that Daniel had been present consistently, helping with daily responsibilities and offering support without expecting anything in return. He also wrote that while Melissa had recently taken a strong interest in organizing financial matters, he believed that the person who had stood beside him throughout the difficult years deserved the responsibility of protecting the home and the family legacy. When the lawyer finished reading that statement, the room fell completely silent again. No one spoke for several long seconds. Melissa remained staring at the document on the table while her earlier confidence slowly faded into a quiet disbelief. Meanwhile I sat there remembering my father's calm smile during those final conversations at the kitchen table. For the first time I finally understood what he had meant when he said that the truth would speak for itself when the moment arrived. The silence in the conference room lasted longer than anyone expected after Mr. Reeves finished reading my father's statement. No one moved at first. My Aunt Linda slowly leaned back in her chair while Mark looked down at the document again as if making sure he had understood it correctly. Melissa remained still, staring at the amendment in front of her. The confident posture she had carried into the meeting had completely disappeared, replaced by a quiet disbelief that seemed to settle over her shoulders. Mr. Reeves carefully placed the document back on the table and folded his hands together. He explained calmly that the amendment had been legally verified and attached to the estate file the same day my father signed it. In other words, the revised will was final. The Maplewood Drive house, the savings accounts, and the responsibility of managing the estate now belonged to me. I remember sitting there for several seconds trying to process the reality of what had just happened. Only a few minutes earlier I had believed everything my father built would pass entirely to my sister. Now the outcome had completely reversed. Melissa finally spoke again, though her voice sounded very different from the confident tone she had used earlier. She asked the lawyer if there was any way the amendment could be challenged or reconsidered. Mr. Reeves answered carefully, explaining that while anyone technically has the right to request a legal review, the document itself had been executed properly with witnesses and legal certification. He added that Robert Carter had appeared fully aware and clear-minded during the meeting when the amendment was signed. The room grew quiet again after that explanation. Melissa looked down at the table for a long moment before slowly closing the leather folder she had brought with her. For the first time since the meeting began she avoided looking directly at me. Meanwhile my thoughts drifted back to the many evenings I had spent with Dad in the Maplewood kitchen. The quiet dinners, the conversations about work, the stories he shared about building his construction company when he was younger. At the time those moments simply felt like ordinary parts of life. Now I understood that he had been paying attention to everything happening around him far more carefully than any of us realized. Eventually the meeting came to an end. Mr. Reeves explained the next steps for handling the estate and provided copies of the documents for everyone present. When we stood up from the table I noticed that the heavy tension that had filled the room earlier had shifted into something calmer, almost reflective. Aunt Linda placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and said that my father had clearly trusted me to protect the home and the family history connected to it. Mark nodded quietly in agreement. Melissa gathered her belongings and headed toward the door without saying much. For a moment I thought she might leave without speaking to me at all. But just before stepping into the hallway she paused and turned back toward the table. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. She said that she had believed she understood what Dad wanted, but now she realized that she had been wrong. I nodded slowly, not knowing exactly what to say in response. There was no anger in that moment, only the strange realization that the entire situation had unfolded exactly the way my father had quietly planned. As I walked out of the building a few minutes later the gray clouds above Columbus had begun to thin slightly, and a narrow line of sunlight stretched across the sidewalk in front of the office. I stood there for a moment remembering something Dad once said during one of those quiet evenings at the kitchen table. He told me that the measure of a person is not what they say they will do when things are easy, but what they choose to do when no one is watching. Now, standing there with the documents in my hand and the future of the Maplewood house resting on my shoulders, I finally understood what he meant. My father had not needed dramatic confrontations or loud accusations to reveal the truth. He simply trusted that when the right moment arrived, the truth would speak clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear it.